Not all graphic novels are created equal. Some create characters and stories to be aspired towards and built upon for generations to come. Others don't, drifting away into obscurity, names only to be uttered quietly in dark corners of the internet. And, every now and then, someone comes across one of these forgotten works and wonders how things went so terribly wrong. The old saying that lightning never strikes the same place twice may or may not be true of weather patterns, but certainly applies to the lost chapter of Frank Miller's Dark Knight saga, the mythically bad The Dark Knight Strikes Again, or DK2 as it was titled on the cover. Appearing 15 years after the original, the book was universally panned by critics, with even the most thoughtful of reviews unable to make heads or tails of the book, most reviewers offering Miller what feels like a perfunctory compliment before batting the book down as lacking in nuance or garish and inconsistent. However, most people's reaction to the story is best summed up by Bob Lipsky of Dreamhaven Books, when he said that a lot of fans feel that Miller wrote DK2 as a big fuck you to everyone. All but forgotten today, my first encounter with this book came from a Batman-themed quiz game, which included the question, which character becomes the Joker in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Strikes Again, an answer that we will come to a bit later on. For now, suffice it to say I was as bewildered as anyone by DK2 when I first read it, my limited knowledge of Frank Miller surely being of little aid to my comprehension. And while I don't now claim to fully understand the sometime fevered dream that is DK2, I have come to an uneasy appreciation for what it attempts, if not always successfully, to accomplish. But before we get to that, the problems with this book must be noted. While I generally try to avoid participating in the internet's favourite pastime of collectively yelling about how bad something is, it would be difficult to discuss DK2 without offering some very well-deserved criticism, from which even the shield of satire cannot protect the book. In fact, I would argue that provided the right medium and intention, that being other than to stoke the basest emotional response in readers, examining the reasons something failed can be instructive. And while DK2 would be an ideal target for some internet-abetted savagery, courtesy of your local clickbait dealer or YouTube list-making robot, let us try and be a little fair. The first thing to note about DK2 is the artwork, and by no objective analysis could this art be considered good. This is an actual image in an actual published, DC-approved graphic novel, and this is my version of the same image, drawn freehand in Adobe Illustrator in about 10 minutes. A comparison which I think says more than I ever could about the quality of the art here on display. Many people over the years have discussed exactly what is wrong with DK2's artwork, and I would love nothing more than to add my own voice to that cacophony. So here I go. The artwork of The Dark Knight Strikes Again is what I can only assume to be the result of Frank Miller discovering MS Paint one afternoon and immediately forgetting that he ever knew how to draw. Characters are rendered within thick black lines, absent any detail to actually define or distinguish, DK2 completely lacking the detailed figures of The Dark Knight Returns. Miller's failure to understand human anatomy is only worsened by DK2's near-complete lack of backgrounds, which makes the action needlessly difficult to position spatially. The loss of something so vital to setting time and place in The Dark Knight Returns is inexplicable and at times hard to believe, and often results in bizarre scenes such as the appearance of Lex Luthor as a giant head in the sky. How this is possible is anyone's guess. Worse yet are the colours in general, solid fills often appearing where one might expect to see actual backgrounds. Once again the responsibility of Lynn Varley, much has been made of this as an early foray into digital colouring, and it certainly shows, with many panels looking like the work of someone recently introduced to the gradient tool. In fact, the colours are so bad the book may have been better served by using a selection of highlighter pens rather than whatever version of Photoshop was current at the time. And I would be remiss to continue without mentioning the book's haphazard layouts, which are randomly arranged to the point at which they could be thrown at a wall, reassembled, and be almost as cohesive, following no discernible comic conventions but also not qualifying as subversive, other than perhaps for the very sake of being subversive. DK2 also discards its predecessor's expert use of splash panels in favour of misusing them so thoroughly to the point at which you could legitimately wonder if misusing them was indeed Miller's intention. 5 splash pages in a row depict a Wonder Woman and Superman sex scene, and another 6 double-page spreads are used to show a sequence in which Batman and Catgirl beat up Lex Luthor. That's 12 pages of the book, containing a story thread which adds nothing to the story other than a Zorro reference and a line of dialogue which makes Batman sound like a terrorist. The terrible artwork leaving you with only the sound of pages turning for company. But no matter what the book lacks in the art department, its greatest villain is undoubtedly the story, the method used to tell it, and the accompanying Sledgehammer-style subtlety. True that The Dark Knight Returns laid out its political agenda quite clearly. However, DK2 takes this to new and unnecessary extremes. Occurring only 3 years after The Dark Knight Returns' Reagan-era setting, DK2 sets its sights on the early noughties Bush government, and does not let up for 250-odd pages. This begins with the reveal that Bush himself is a hologram, with the government being run from the shadows by actual supervillains. The commentary only gets heavier from there, Batman explaining to the Flash in one scene that the real criminals have always been the politicians, a claim that doesn't really hold water if the government has been completely infiltrated by supervillains. But these logical problems don't stop the Flash from photobombing former Attorney General John Ashcroft, or the passage of the Freedom from Information Act, a piece of legislation whose real-life counterpart, the Patriot Act, has a more subversive title. Miller's distaste for corporate America runs steadily throughout this book, which depicts citizens as docile invalids whose attention can only be held by pornified versions of the news. In place of the talk show panels of The Dark Knight Returns, some pages feature frames representative of chat room discourse from the early days of internet forums, and as a result offer little to the story other than nonsense. The new heroes of this world are now sexually manipulative but brainless entertainers that ape the actual heroes of yesteryear, so clearly DK2 has some gripes with the comic book industry as well. But these themes and story beats are nothing that has not been better approached by works like Fahrenheit 451, and quite often DK2 is a patronizing slog rather than a thoughtful examination of modern society. The story's actual villains turn out to be Luthor and Brainiac, who have captured various superheroes and disabled them or put them to work in their institution, Flash serving as a human generator that powers most of America under threat of the life of Iris Allen West, and Superman being similarly controlled for fear of the miniaturized city of Kandor. Batman himself is absent for most of the first issue, appearing for the first time on page 75 to punch Superman again because everyone really liked that last time. He then sets out to free the imprisoned heroes and defeat the establishment with his usual gusto, but a serious lack of actual genius, choosing simply to overpower his enemies rather than actually outsmart anyone. But beyond all of these kicks to the stomach, perhaps the most disappointing aspect of DK2 is the loss of the once heroic nature of these characters. Since Miller's own Batman Year One, Batman had been adept at striking terror, but even in his darkest moments, he never resolved to murder his enemies. That all changes here, with Hawkeye's son caving the skull of Lex Luthor on Batman's orders, the only explanation on offer from Batman being, "Get used to it, Barry, these youngsters play it rough." Carrie Kelly has no qualms with killing the Joker when he appears, and Superman's daughter Lara gladly murders Brainiac when given the opportunity. Even Batman himself is happy to chop off the head of Dick Grayson, who yes has taken up the mantle of the somewhat physically invulnerable Joker. When that fails to kill him, Batman then drops him into the volcano beneath the Batcave. The reveal that the President is controlled by supervillains is also supremely disappointing, as it detracts from the political dimensions of the work, creating a less subversive story that works directly against the message Miller seems so desperate to communicate. Decisions such as the return of Oliver Queen's arm with the use of a robotic prosthesis, and a redux of the recently deceased Joker also hurt the conclusivity of The Dark Knight Returns, in favor of the classic comic book adage of cyclical plot and the maintenance of the status quo. But maybe that was exactly what Miller had in mind. Now, the intention of the author is a moot point these days, especially when the work itself is a failure, but many of DK2's bizarre choices can be justified as a commentary on the state of modern comic books becoming too serious. In an interview with the Comics Journal, Miller said his intention was to recapture the magic of reading comic books as a child, though for an adult audience. Miller describes his artwork as a reaction to a trend in comics to become too damn realistic, choosing to emphasize the parts that make characters look heroic, which for Miller was specifically gigantic hands and feet. The incorporation of a larger cast of heroes as well as their otherworldly threats and abilities makes DK2 a work antithetical to the legacy of The Dark Knight Returns, an awkward choice for a sequel to make. As such, Miller seems to be challenging the very movement he was responsible for starting. Was it then a smart choice to make The Dark Knight Strikes Again a sequel to The Dark Knight Returns, rather than a standalone story? The easy answer is, of course, no. DK2 managing to simultaneously disappoint readers expecting a story similar to the original and earn the ire of critics the world over. But perhaps that was the point. By targeting DK2 at audiences conditioned into expecting gritty realism from their heroes, Miller gives himself a platform he would not have had without attaching the Dark Knight name. Whether or not that justifies so many shortcomings is a subject for debate. It must also be noted that DK2 was substantially changed following the September 11 terror attacks, which Miller witnessed from his home in New York while working on the book. Occurring partway through writing the story, the fairly light-hearted satire of American political institutions and figures is interrupted by the annihilation of Metropolis in issue 3, a jarring transition from space battles and dinosaur fights. While only partially responsible for the book's schizophrenic tone, Miller's anger is visible in his careless plotting and the aforementioned murders which are confined to the book's second half. This anger would see Miller go on to write Holy Terror, a self-proclaimed propaganda comic featuring Batman analog The Fixer taking on the forces of Al-Qaeda in a throwback to the days of Golden Age superheroes intervening in real-world conflicts. It is also a natural extension of DK2, featuring a similar art style, jaundiced view of reality, and the morally compromised heroes that exist only as symbols of violence where hope once existed. Holy Terror was poorly received for many of the same reasons DK2 has been dismissed, while also adding the deliberate courting of controversy and conflation of Islam with wholesale terrorism to that list. Its only saving grace being that it makes DK2 look mild by comparison. And in recent times, this has been the trend of criticism in hindsight, with several defenses of The Dark Knight Strikes Again appearing with the claim that it is not so inconsistent when the weirdness of its progenitor is properly considered, one writer going so far as to defend the book's artwork, stopping just short of praising its colouring. Whether this is a simple case of rose-tinted glasses or genuine fatigue with the corporatization of DC Comics is difficult to say, and personally I remain unconvinced of the late career Miller's genius. But regardless of my views, DK2 is undoubtedly a troubled novel which still manages to mark an interesting moment in the history of DC Comics and Frank Miller's bibliography. But, through the recent release of The Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, the announcement of the prequel story The Last Crusade, and Miller's contemplation of a fourth canonical project, we can all rest assured that there will be plenty more questionable returns to this unique Batman universe still to come.